making a change, anything like that, we'll do a little bit of coaching there. So one of the things I thought I'd start with tonight is just this idea of what mindful coaching is versus coaching, because I actually blend both mindfulness and coaching together on purpose. And I'm trained as a yoga teacher, so I have mindfulness training, and I'm also trained as a coach. And what I have discovered is that putting the two together is synergistic. And so if you do one or the other, you don't get nearly as much benefit. So a lot of people say, well, mindfulness is evidence-based for burnout. It's evidence-based for stress. So it definitely helps you. And coaching is evidence-based for those things also. Together, they actually work synergistically and help people make change, especially people who are maybe stuck or struggling to make decisions. And many of us in medicine, we get stuck more easily because of a lot of the physician thought patterns we have. And I'm going to talk about a few of those tonight as well. The other thing about mindful coaching is that it's not goal focused. So it's not focused on like maybe getting that perfect job. I like to think of it as feeling focused. So we often know how we want to feel in life. Maybe why you moved across the country, for example, you know how you want to feel in life, but you don't know what that job looks like or what you're going to do to help you feel that way. But when you can connect with how you want to feel, it's much easier to work backwards. And there are certain coaching models that we use there. And so that's where I like to think of it as mindfulness, because most of us can mindfully connect to feelings and emotions and how we would like to feel, getting out of that rational mind of my job should have a list of these benefits and, and these outcomes. And so I find it a really helpful way to help people end up doing something they actually want to be doing rather than what they think they should be doing. And usually in the end, it also meets those other requirements. I was actually just reading a book on decision-making, and she talks about how our lists of pros and cons actually helps us make much worse decisions, and that's actually a terrible decision-making tool. And so, and it makes sense when you start to think about what the value of the criteria, because it doesn't value the criteria in the same way, and it doesn't value what you want out of life in the same way. And so coaching really gets into a lot of that feelings and alignment in who you want to be. So that's really why I bring in mindfulness. And then I wanted to bring in this idea of the way I approach mindful coaching. It's a little bit different than a lot of coaches approach it, in that the first step is really noticing and being aware and understanding your thought patterns and understanding these unhelpful thought patterns that many of us have as physicians, and many of them were trained into us. So if you think about like a scarcity mindset, and urgency and catastrophizing and doubting ourselves, I can go on forever on these, but like rumination and worrying in advance and over responsibility. And I'm seeing all these nodding heads, like self-sacrifice and martyrdom and right and wrong, and some other ones, hard is better and easy is not valuable. All of these things color all of our decisions because we think in that way and we were trained to think in that way. And so a big part of the work of mindful coaching is to notice and become aware of all of those thought patterns. And there are a ton of them. And we actually spend time going through a lot of them in group coaching and or in one-on-one coaching, but really important to begin to see those and to begin to see the impact that they have on your life. So when you can see them and you can see the impact of them, the shame, blame, and guilt patterns are some of the big ones, and trying to always fix, manage, and control things. Those give us a life that we don't necessarily want. And so the biggest thing is noticing them. The second piece is realizing that, and I like to just say they're not our fault because most of them are trained into us. And so when you're coming at it from this perspective that they're not your fault, you are no longer in shame, blame, and guilt. And that's where your amygdala can learn and change. When we're in judgment and shame, blame, and guilt, we don't make change. And so I like to just say they're not our fault. And I actually kind of believe that, knowing the training process that most of us went to, and everyone here is a woman. And so some of these thought patterns also were gifted to us as women in our culture. And so we have sort of a double whammy. And then I also like to point out that noticing them is the key thing. So a lot of us think, okay, well, I have these thought patterns, I have to change them. And in mindful coaching, 90% of the benefit comes in understanding them and seeing how they impact you. you can change them and you will change them eventually, but there's no urgency to change them and there's no rush to change them, because once you notice them, they lose a lot of their power and they lose a lot of their impact. So that to me is the first reason why we bring mindfulness in. And then the second reason is that you can't change when you're in some pathomimetic storm or threatened. And most of us live in that constant state. And so bringing in mindfulness, and again, the mindfulness is a lot of the noticing. It can be breathing, it can be yoga. It doesn't have to be sitting on your mat for 45 minutes. I just like to point out there's tons of different ways to do it. And I feel like there's a way for everyone to do it. So I work with people until we figure out a way that works for them. I'm not a traditional meditator, 45 minutes on the mat. I like to do mindfulness in nature. That's what works for me, or yoga. And I actually got into yoga because I really struggled to sit on my mat and meditate and like follow the rules. I still do. But when I'm moving, I can be much more mindful. And so we all approach it in a slightly different way. And then you have to bring compassion into it, which is a big piece of the mindfulness also. And so if you're here judging and being mean to yourself, which is another thought pattern, common behavior that we all have in medicine, we think that's the way forward and we are so good at it. We don't make change from that sort of judgmental, threatened way. Shuts down our amygdala. And we know, like in neuroscience, that that's not the way to rewire your brain, which is what you're doing in coaching. And then the other place that we really cannot make change is from a place of depletion and exhaustion and empty. And so for me, the mindfulness is really focusing on repleting you and noticing what energizes you. It's one of the reasons that I do retreats, because we focus on the repletion. We just take care of it right there in the moment. But you can also do it at home once you're noticing and aware of what you need to be repleting yourself, and to understand that when we can step out of this hurry and actually focus on that re-energizing and refilling your cup, that's where the coaching works. So I see a lot of people getting into trouble just being mean to themselves about what hasn't worked, or I know that I'm supposed to think it this way and it's not working. And so sort of refilling your cup actually really helps a lot of that stuff stick and stay and last. And so sometimes people say, well, I do coaching and it didn't stick. Without mindfulness, it doesn't stick. And I use mindfulness in the way that all of those things are brought into it. And then the last bit is really the mindset traditional coaching tools. And so when you've learned to pause, when you've taken care of your nervous system, then you can make these mindset shifts and looking at your thought patterns, and you can work on changing them. Your brain is much more receptive to different ways of thinking and shifting perspective and creative solutions. And so from that standpoint, you can start to look at some of these simple catchphrases. What's your favorite one, Sandra, that you're still using? Picking on you, of course, but I know you've got one.
So you mean catchphrase, things I tell myself all the time? Or
Yeah.
Well, just probably that I should be doing something.
Okay. And what do you say instead? Because now you notice that you're saying that.
Yeah. I choose to do something.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that we talked about at the retreat, is instead of like I should, it's like I choose to, or I get to, or I want to. And so changing even that one word all of a sudden changes all the energy. And then you're not in this sort of angsty, frustrated spot, and everything feels really different. Some of the other ones that I think are helpful is not about me. That's something I use. I used to think that, when I worked in clinic, people would say things or do things, staff or colleagues, and it's almost always not about you. It's about their own depletion or about their own situation. Even family member stuff is usually not about you, except that we are all trained to think it is about us. And we were trained to think that we can control all of that if we act in a different way or are a different way. And so that is one of my favorite simple phrases. So there are many different things in coaching. There's a whole body of work about different ways of thinking about things, or telling different stories, for example, changing your language. And asking good questions is another tool that we do a lot of in coaching. And so we can talk about some of these or dive into coaching. And I think when you've done that pre-work, the mindfulness work, and you now have the pause and you have the space to actually do some of this rewiring, that coaching piece becomes really natural and actually much faster than it otherwise is, and it sticks. And so it doesn't stick forever. I do think that one of the really important things is to not be in a rush and not be urgent to make things just change overnight, because what I find is people who stick with this work over time, they just become a new person. They think about things differently and they don't fall back into those old habits. But you've been practicing these old thoughts that I mentioned forever, most of you, your whole life. And so it takes time to begin to shift out of them. You notice them and then you're like, oh, here I'm shoulding again. And so let me think, I'm going to choose to do this instead, or I'm going to say I get to do this, or I want to do this, as opposed to I have to, staying out of that victimhood spot. And so your brain can actually learn to focus on things differently. A couple other things I was going to mention is this idea of coming from your strengths rather than your weaknesses. And so coaching, we really work on this idea of what are you really good at and optimizing the things you're great at. We were all taught to focus on all the things we're bad at and really work at those with our negativity bias, looking at what's wrong. And we don't get nearly as far and we don't enjoy our lives as much as if we come from the strength-based and alignment-based approach. And so coaching really helps you learn about that as well. And then one of the other things I just like to bring up and kind of an introduction to coaching is that coaching is changing your thoughts, but there are many times when we also need to change our circumstances. So many people need to leave their job, change their job, but they want to do that first and they don't clean up their mindset first, in the sense that they're like, I'll just get out of this job and I'll feel better. But then they either don't know where to go or they move to another job and they don't feel better anyway because they didn't clean up their thinking. And so I really like to pay attention to when to change your thoughts and when to make a change. And the way that I like to think about it is you want to change your thoughts first either way. And when you've changed your thoughts, then you can make the change and it usually works out well. And you're also making a change from a place of alignment. And so we don't want to just immediately jump to that change. Unless your situation is, as I like to say, toxic, then sometimes you actually need to get out of it. Or sometimes you make the change and then you pause and then you do the work. Or I've had people that give notice, but they have to give 6 months notice. And so they have plenty of time to do the work to figure out what's next. And so realizing that we have very much of an urgency bias, and I call it urgency tax. We want to change it and fix it. And we think there's a there. And so what coaching really teaches you is that changing the situation isn't going to change the circumstances unless you also understand how to manage your mind. And the smarter your mind, the actually harder it is to manage. That's why coaching works for people with very smart brains, because we're like overdriving in our brain all the time, trying to make things work. And so that's where the mindfulness piece and the relaxing in allows you to start to rewire and think about things differently so you can approach things differently going forward and actually end up doing things that are in alignment that you actually want to be doing rather than what you should be doing, if that makes sense.